Hey everybody, Garry Adelman, American Battlefield Trust. Here we are at Five Forks. We've got Kris White behind the camera over there. You'll probably see his face before long. And you are on our 160 swing through the Appomattox Campaign. But first we have to do more around Petersburg. Hopefully you've already watched our City Point video where we sort of set the stage. And we want to set the stage here and then get into a little bit more fighting. What happens at Five Forks? You're seeing the actual intersection, the actual forks right here. Now, our good friend and El Señor Petersburg, Will Greene, is here, co-founder of the American Battlefield Trust, which was founded in his living room with a bunch of other guys you've heard of at the time. Welcome, Will.
Thank you, Garry. It's great to be with you, and I'm really pleased to be working with the American Battlefield Trust again. I've always felt that preservation is a means to an end, and the end is getting people onto the ground and explaining what has happened. And these videos, I think, are a great stimulus for people to come out and see what the American Battlefield Trust has done and other organizations to make the Civil War story come alive. And there's no better place than Five Forks, because you're looking at a scene that is very similar to what it was in 1865. This intersection did not have a structure on it. It was just a rural intersection that happened to have significance because it provided the shortest access to the South Side Railroad. This intersection, otherwise nondescript in the middle of deepest, darkest Dinwiddie County, became the focal point for a federal assault on April the 1st, 1865.
All right, great. Well, so, we're aware that a lot of these Civil War battles, they devolve around transportation facilities, and Petersburg is very well known for that. So there's a long attempt and numerous battles and offensives we won't talk about in order to try to limit that number of railroads until it's down to one. And after the winter passes, we sort of have things really heating up as we get into late March of 1865, and I'll let you interpret that however you'd like so that you can set the stage for Five Forks.
Well, General Lee was aware that things were looking pretty bad for him. By the winter of 1864 and 65, he was understanding that sooner or later they would probably have to give up Petersburg and Richmond. And in an effort to open an escape route in order to move his Army of Northern Virginia south and west to link up with Joseph Johnston's army in North Carolina, he launched what was called Lee's Last Grand Offensive, the attack on March 25th at Fort Stedman. It failed, and as a result of that, General Grant, with the roads drying up and transportation being much more feasible, decided to launch his final offensive on March the 29th. Now, Lee attempted to defend the South Side Railroad by assaulting the leading element of Grant's army, which was Sheridan's cavalry, on March the 31st. That occurred about 4 miles to the south and east of us in a day-long battle known as the Battle of Dinwiddie Courthouse. That battle really was a defeat for Phil Sheridan, but because of another engagement that occurred about 4 miles to our east here, the Battle of White Oak Road, an element of the 5th Union Corps under Gouverneur Warren started to move towards Five Forks, which would have placed them in the rear of the Confederates who fought at Dinwiddie Courthouse. And that compelled the Confederate commander out here, George Pickett, to move back from his victory at Dinwiddie Courthouse and take a position of about 1 3/4 miles long on the north side of this road here, which is the White Oak Road. Now, General Lee was a little disappointed in Pickett's failure to hold his position at Dinwiddie Courthouse, and allegedly he sent Pickett a rather harsh message. Exceedingly disappointed that you weren't able to hold the ground that you took yesterday. Hold Five Forks at all hazards. And those were Pickett's orders. Now, Pickett will claim after the battle that he wanted to move his defensive line about 1 mile to the north of us, behind the stream called Hatcher's Run, which would have provided a natural moat and a strong position for him. But Lee's orders were imperative: hold Five Forks at all hazards. And on April the 1st, General Sheridan, who now has recovered his equilibrium and is feeling optimistic again, is going to be reinforced by the Union Fifth Corps under the command of Governor Kemble Warren. And I would argue that other than the Battle of the Crater, Five Forks is probably the most famous of the many Petersburg engagements, not the least of which because General Warren will be relieved on the field of his command. Grant has finally, on April the 1st, stretched Lee to the point where he cannot defend in a solid line his entire Confederate defenses.
And I think it's also a good segue into the fact that it's George Pickett who's out here on an independent command. We're seeing here in early April that Lee now is not using his, what I would call an A-team. I mean, George Pickett gets a lot of blame for things during the war, but the last week of this war doesn't go well for George Pickett here or at Sailor's Creek, which we'll see down the road. So, you know, you have Fitzhugh Lee here, who's an experienced commander, the nephew of Robert E. Lee, but you have George Pickett. And is it Pickett out here because he's just out at this portion of the battlefield and at the right place at the wrong time? Or
you have a great capacity for asking me questions that I have not come up with an answer for, because Pickett's division had spent most of the campaign up at Bermuda 100, and as Kris would suggest, not by accident, because that was one of the quietest places on the entire line. And Lee did not have a lot of confidence in Pickett. So if you wanted to put somebody where there wasn't a lot of danger, a lot of contingency, Bermuda 100 was the place to put him. But right before Five Forks, Lee will send Mahone's division to replace Pickett at Bermuda 100. And that is something that I want to look into and try to, there must have been a rationale behind that, but on the surface, as you would suggest, trading Mahone for Pickett would not be a good trade. And so, yes, George Pickett is down here. He doesn't have his whole division, incidentally. 2 of his 5 brigades belong to Bushrod Johnson's division. 3 of his brigades are his own. So not only is Pickett operating with troops that are maybe a little bit subpar to the rest of the army, but he doesn't have his whole division here either. He's got 2 brigades that he knows nothing really about. Ransom's and Wallace's brigades of Bushrod Johnson's division. So, you know, things are kind of stacked up against him here. Fitz Lee, who was the overall commander now, with Hampton gone to South Carolina, Fitz Lee is the commander of the cavalry. He, along with Pickett and Tom Rosser, one of his division commanders, have gone back on the other side of Hatcher's Run to enjoy a little bit of a lunch. And they were going to be indulging in one of the Virginia delicacies that another thing I've never been able to understand, why people love the bony fish shad, but they do, and there was a little shad bacon. We may actually go there a little bit later on in our tour. But as a result, the 2 leading commanders on the battlefield for the Confederates, Fitz Lee and George Pickett, are absent. The ranking officer is Rooney Lee. But where is Rooney Lee? Rooney Lee is at the far western end of the line. And where do the Federals intend to make their assault? On the far eastern end of the line, which is someplace we might want to go.
Yeah, and that was a great segue. So here we are. It's April 1st, 1865. We have the Confederates facing towards the south. A little bit of them are facing out towards the west. Some are facing towards the east. But essentially, these 10,000 or so Confederates are hanging out here in the air. They are going to be separated from the rest of Lee's army. Coming up from the south, coming in from the west, will be Phil Sheridan's Army of the Shenandoah with his cavalry. And then the Union 5th Army Corps, who we're going to talk about at our next tour stop, will be trying to make their way towards this battlefield and trying to hit as a hammer from one side while Sheridan holds in front and comes in from the other side. So this is really another one of those no-win situations. And with George Pickett out here, for those of you who like George Pickett, we're not just out here having our way with George Pickett, but Phil Sheridan and Governor K. Warren are just about to. So let's get more into those personalities here at our next stop. We have moved down the Confederate line. We've gone east towards Petersburg. We've moved just a little bit more than a mile over to the Confederate left flank, or what we thought was the Confederate left flank for the Union Army on April 1st, 1865. So Will, what's the plan here for the Union 5th Army Corps? We have Sheridan holding in the front. We have them sort of coming around the Confederate right flank, but now we have this 5th Army Corps under Gouverneur Kimball Warren. Sheridan has worked well in the Valley Campaign of '64 with Horatio Wright of the Army of the Potomac, the 6th Corps, but now we're seeing a new element here. 5th Corps, who stayed here at Petersburg. Gouverneur Kimball Warren, once a star on the rise, kind of is now fading. Warren's job is to come in here, hit the left, while Sheridan hits from the front holding, and then over on the Confederate right.
Yeah, if we thought that Five Forks was an obscure intersection in the world of the Civil War, this is really an obscure intersection. No signs, nothing, but this is an important spot because the road in front of us running east and west is that same White Oak Road along which the Confederates had built their defenses. But the north-south road here is called the Gravelly Run Church Road. And it was named after a meeting house that's about a mile to the south of us here on the banks of Gravelly Run. And it was this access that all the intelligence in the Union Army believed was the left flank of the Confederate line. And so as Kris indicated, Sheridan's battle plan was to have Warren attack this flank, turn 90 degrees and roll up the Confederate line from east to west. At the same time, George Armstrong Custer's cavalry division would be making a diversionary attack against the Confederate right flank. And once Warren's juggernaut got rolling, Thomas Devon's division, dismounted, would attack the center near the Five Forks intersection. But the key to all of this was Warren. Now, Warren, as we mentioned briefly, was at White Oak Road about 3.5 miles to the east of us on March the 31st. But at the end of the day, he got orders to come down to reinforce Sheridan. Now, Grant, for reasons of not understanding the geography, indicated to Sheridan that Warren would arrive to reinforce him shortly after midnight. Well, that was logistically impossible. Warren doesn't show up until a little bit after dawn on April the 1st, but this starts Sheridan thinking that Warren is a slacker. Sheridan and Warren hadn't gotten along to begin with, and this is another nail in Warren's coffin. Warren gets his battle plan about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and he moves up in position by about 4, which I think was a reasonable amount of time given the poor roads and what he had to do. He aligned his 3 divisions, Romain Ayres' division on his left, he had Samuel Crawford's division on his right, and Charles Griffin's division in reserve behind. And they were ready to go about 4 o'clock. Now Sheridan is chomping at the bit. He is believing that Warren is dragging his feet again. By noon, around noon, Orville Babcock, one of Grant's aides-de-camp, had ridden from Grant's headquarters out to Sheridan and gave Sheridan specific authority, on Grant's word, that he could relieve Warren of command if Sheridan felt that Warren was performing in a subpar way. All right, so you can see that things are setting up kind of badly for Warren. About 4:15, maybe 4:10, Warren's corps comes up the Gravelly Run Church Road to this intersection, ready to attack the Confederate left flank. There's no Confederates anywhere in sight. But Warren spots about 300 yards ahead of us a wood line, and he believes, well, that's probably where the Confederates were located. And so he goes forward with Crawford's division to the north, basically marching off the battlefield. Ayres' division on the left spots the Confederate line half a mile or so to our west, and he moves to make the assault. Griffin will then come up and join Ayres, and they will sequentially roll up the Confederate line. Matt Ransom's brigade falls first, Wallace's South Carolinians fall next. Maryland Stewart's brigade is next. They turn from facing to the south to turn to face to the east to try to stop this roller coaster with Sheridan at the front yelling them to go forward, while Warren has gone up with Crawford. Now Warren will ride back to this area, and he will actually give the orders to Griffin to move up to reinforce Ayres. And then Warren will ride forward to Crawford and give Crawford orders to turn back to the west. And we'll pick up the story about what Warren does at our next stop.
Yeah, and just to pick up here for a moment, Will, that was fantastic, by the way, is the Union Army is coming up through here. Number one, Sheridan, as I say, has the nuclear codes in his pocket, and that is the orders that he can relieve Warren if Warren isn't performing. And I've always said if you give someone like that, someone like him, the nuclear codes, he's going to use them, and that, I think he's just looking for an excuse. Governor Warren, before this, he was on a star on the rise. He had performed well in 1861, 1862. Of course, he's a hero of Gettysburg. And then you go off to Mine Run, and that's where his star starts to fall. At one point, William French is going to turn to George Gordon Meade and say, where are your young Napoleon's guns now? Because Warren doesn't go in and attack like he's supposed to, and doesn't tell his boss that he's not going to. In the Wilderness, he makes some prudent decisions not to attack right away, even though he's pressed by Grant. Spotsylvania, he falls into some problems here. And by Petersburg, at the head of the 5th Corps, you know, he's putting together a mixed reputation to the point where his chief of artillery will say that he has a screw loose and is not accountable for all of his little freaks. Because to me, Warren's a manic depressive kind of guy. If you read his letters, he's on high highs, low lows, and he's a fascinating character. And for an engineer, he has beautiful, beautiful artistry. He can draw anything, but his handwriting's terrible. It's abysmal. You would think he had better handwriting. But to get here on the evening of March 31st and April 1st, it's raining. It's dark, there are roads flooding, there are bridges that are out, and he has to make this movement, basically this Herculean effort. And I think this is one of Grant's Achilles' heels from May of 1864 all the way up until he ends the war here at Appomattox. And that is, he never understands how far a distance is here in the Eastern Theater and how long it will take to move a corps from here to here. He does this in Wilderness, Spotsylvania, down to Cold Harbor. He does it over and over again, and I think it comes here to haunt Warren. And finally, before we move on to our next stop, one of my favorite stories is Charles Griffin and Roman Ayres are coming up here. These are two grizzled West Point veterans, really, really good soldiers. According to Roman Ayres' obituary, he's allegedly the only officer in the Army of the Potomac to serve in every one of its battles. I don't think he can make that claim, but his obituary did. But as these two divisions are coming up here, they can see Crawford going off in that direction, and Griffin rides over to Ayres and says, "There goes Crawford." They know how Samuel Wiley Crawford, the 3rd Division commander here, is wont to always make the right decisions. So they were no surprise that, hey, look, our division's got to go do the work because there goes Crawford again. So it's interesting to see the dynamics playing here between the personalities. We have Pickett out here, Fitz Lee, Tom Rosser, they're having a shad bake. Then we have Sheridan, who's not worked with Warren. Warren, whose division commanders know each other's quirks by now because they've served together for so long. But what we're seeing out here is Warren, even though he was an up and down general throughout 1864, early 1865, he's doing exactly what he's supposed to do. He's trying to make contact with the enemy. When he does make contact with the enemy, he puts in all of his force, and he's going to try to make sure that he lands that killing blow. And finally, this attack coming in from the Confederate left is doing something important. Not only is it going towards the railroad, it is also isolating Pickett's 10,000 men from the rest of the Petersburg garrison. So what we're doing is destroying that piece of Lee's army.
Yeah, one personality we haven't mentioned is Ranald Mackenzie. He was probably more famous in the Indian Wars than he is in the Civil War, but he was the nominal division commander of the cavalry of the Army of the James. And when elements of the Army of the James came down to south of the Appomattox as part of Grant's final offensive, Mackenzie's job was to isolate, as Kris indicates, make sure there's no connection between Pickett's men and Richard Anderson's Confederates who are up there on Claiborne Road. And so Mackenzie is the one who is riding around through here and driving William P. Roberts, the youngest Confederate general incidentally, away from reinforcing Pickett and allowing Pickett to understand what's going to happen out here. And Warren tells Mackenzie to ride really far north to try to get to the railroad and get Crosshatch's Run to the north. You know, Warren is a good general in many ways. His troops loved him. His troops were very upset when Warren gets fired out here. But
Not to give away that story.
yeah, nobody knows about that. But have you ever met somebody who's a subordinate who always has a better idea than you as the boss? I think all of us have worked with people like that. And sometimes their ideas are pretty good, sometimes they're not so good, but they're always delivered forcefully. And that was Gouverneur Warren. He always had a better way to do things than his superiors wanted him to do. And so Sheridan is smelling all of this. I mean, in a way, Warren is setting up his demise by his previous performances here. But as we indicated, to close here, as we indicated, so far Warren is doing okay at Five Forks, and the things for which he was blamed were not his fault.
And let's pick up that story here at our last stop and close off the Battle of Five Forks. All right, so we have moved to our final tour stop on this video, and what we have done is we have gone just north of Five Forks. So we're just north there. We're below Hatcher's Run, we're below the Southside Railroad, but we are within the Confederate sphere with Federals coming from this direction. So but before we finish off our Federal advance here, Will, I think it's important to talk about where's George Pickett, Fitzhugh Lee, Tom Rosser?
Well, they are about a mile or so to the north of us enjoying this shad dinner that we talked about. Nobody specifically says that they had wine with it, but I suspect that they did, being good Virginia gentlemen that they were. And their problem, I don't think you can criticize so much Pickett and Fitz Lee for being there. The conventional wisdom was there was not going to be an attack here that day. There was no indication of an attack. Where you can criticize them is that they did not inform their remaining officers where they were, where they could be found. And so when the attack begins off here on the Confederate left, as we discussed at our last stop, Tom Munford is sending couriers to try to find Fitz Lee and Pickett to tell them what's going on, that Warren is starting to attack, but he can't find them because he has not allowed, because Fitz Lee and Pickett did not tell everybody where they were. So this brings us back to Gouverneur Warren, Kris, and we last left Warren back at the intersection of Gravelly Run Church Road and White Oak Road. Warren had been marching off with Crawford's division, basically off the battlefield. But he had ridden back to tell Griffin to come up, and so when Griffin and Ayres make their assault, they will roll up the Confederates and get to this road here, and this is the Ford Church or Ford Station Road. Ford Station was a depot on the Southside Railroad, and Ford Meeting House was a little country church here. And this was the road that led to the railroad. This is why the Battle of Five Forks took place. Warren then rode back up to catch up with Crawford. Now Crawford is marching to the north, but Warren tells him, turn, move to the west, and head for the Ford Station Road. And this is what Crawford will do. He'll move through a large field owned by a man named Sidner, come through these woods, and hit the Ford Station Road just about where we are right now. Right before Crawford arrives on the scene, George Pickett, who has now been informed of all the chaos that is going on his line, has ridden down south on the Ford Station Road, sort of like you see in the cowboy movies, on this side of his horse, shielding himself from the fire from Crawford's men coming out of the woods, and he will make it down to the Five Forks intersection. And he will turn one of his brigades, Colonel Mayo's brigade, in charge of William Terry's brigade. Colonel Mayo will turn from facing to the south to face back to the north, because Crawford has now reached, with Warren and right with him, has reached the Ford Station Road. They've intersected the road, and now they're turning back to attack the rear of the Confederate line. They will overrun Mayo's brigade, The survivors from the rest of the Confederate line will move to the west side of Ford Road, down by the intersection, facing to the east, trying to hold off the Federals so they can make their escape off to the west and the north. That's Montgomery Corse's brigade. And who's the one that overruns Corse's brigade? Crawford with Warren. And this is all happening about 7 o'clock at night, just about dark. And now Corse has been dispatched, and the Confederate survivors are fleeing off to the northwest. About half of Pickett's army has become casualties, mostly prisoners, some 650 killed and wounded. And Kris, what happens about 7 o'clock that evening between Sheridan and Warren?
And at this point, we have Union soldiers coming this way, Union soldiers this way, Union soldiers that way. They're going in that direction. Warren is somewhere near where we are. He's on horseback. He's been doing his job. And Sheridan is probably down around the Five Forks intersection when he sends the order up here to relieve Warren of command. Warren, in the midst of all of this, in the midst of a Union victory of all things here over a portion of Robert E. Lee's army, is relieved of command. And it really just goes back to personalities. And Sheridan over the years will come up with, he didn't think Warren was doing his job. Well, in fact, it's only about, 400 yards or so from them to ride back and forth to talk to each other. Sheridan doesn't make an effort really to communicate with Warren during this battle. And now here we are. He's going to relieve Warren at the height of this battle. He's done a lot of things throughout the war, Warren, good and bad. But right here, he's winning a battle for him. And what will hang on, and we'll talk about this too. What will happen here is Warren's relieved of command. Charles Griffin, a division commander, will take over the 5th Corps, and Warren will stay in the Army for the rest of his life because he wants to be vindicated for what happened here at Five Forks. He's going to ask for a court of inquiry. And what happens after this is the Johnson administration won't give him one. Who's the next president of the United States? Ulysses S. Grant. Grant will say, you're not getting a court of inquiry because he's the one who gave the authority to Sheridan. It will finally be after Grant's administration and William T. Sherman, who's in charge of the Army, who finally grants Warren his court of inquiry. And this will take place in the 1880s. And this is the who's who of the Civil War. We even have in death George Custer's letters coming in here testifying. Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, former Confederates, will testify in this court of inquiry. They'll actually come down here. Men like Winfield Scott Hancock and Christopher Columbus Augur will be on the board. They'll come down here. They'll tour the Five Forks battlefield. Sheridan will claim he has no interest in this, claim he has no interest at all. And in 1883, the verdict will finally come down. Warren's basically absolved of all charges, but by this point, he's dead. He had died a few months before the inquiry had ended and it had come out with its verdict. He will tell his wife, Emily, to bury him in a plain black suit because he has died a disgraced soldier. And it's a really sad ending to this soldier. But one of the things one footnote in the Sheridan part of the story, Sheridan's going to claim he's not interested in this at all. Well, and I found back in about 2008, I was going through an archives and I found a little blue booklet and it had about the Five Forks controversy, and I opened it up and right in front of it is Phil Sheridan's signature made out to his lawyer for these hearings, and it was all the testimony on his behalf that Sheridan had created and basically came up with his own propaganda and sent out into the world. And when I asked Eric Wittenberg about this, my good friend Eric, he said, well, he's just a compulsive liar. What can you say about Phil Sheridan? He also says the same thing about Alfred Pleasanton. But it's interesting that this battle at Five Forks will help to end the Civil War, and a lot of people forget about it, but it will be the battle for the rest of Gouverneur K. Warren's life. That hero of Little Round Top will get that beautiful Carl Gerhardt statue there, and one of the reasons it was placed at Little Round Top 5 years after his death is because his friends wanted to commemorate his actions during the war, and it showed that this was the height of his career, and to give him a little bit more justice because this is a guy who died a disgraced soldier. Will, I don't know what your take is.
Well, I think one of the happy circumstances of Warren's dismissal here is that testimony that Kris mentioned in the court of inquiry fills a stack of papers about that thick with witnesses from every possible angle, which means that this battlefield is as well documented as any battlefield in the entire Civil War landscape, including places like Gettysburg and Shiloh and Chickamauga that had the veterans coming back and marking places. Happily, thanks to the Conservation Fund, the National Park Service, the American Battlefield program, the Five Forks battlefield is very well preserved. And if sometime in the future, the stewards of this battlefield, the National Park Service, can get the wherewithal, they could restore this battlefield to its exact appearance in 1865 because of all of the evidence that was provided during the court of inquiry.
Including maps, fantastic maps too.
Unbelievable.
So let's close out this video, Will. It's the end of the Battle of Five Forks. It's April 1st, 1865. Ulysses S. Grant has received word that Sheridan is victorious here. What's the next steps?
Well, when Babcock rides back to Grant's field headquarters at Dabney's Mill on the evening of April 1st to report the victory at Five Forks, some of the staff members and hangers-on around headquarters said, "Oh, April Fools, you got to be kidding." And no, this was, Babcock convinced them very quickly that this was a terrific victory. And so Grant very calmly walks into his tent, writes on his Manifold folder, comes out with orders to make an all-out attack the next morning on April the 2nd. And April the 2nd, although Five Forks is the setup, the real culmination, the real determinant day in the Petersburg campaign is April 2nd. And that's what we'll talk about next.
Great, we're about to see the end of this 292-day siege here in Petersburg. And I really want to thank Will for being out here. He's going to join us for our next video, so stick with us. We're going to follow this to the breakthrough where the members of the American Battlefield Trust and others have done a lot of work to bring that battlefield back together. And we are going to continue with our story, which will eventually take us out to Appomattox Courthouse. So we hope that you'll stick with us. So thanks to Gary behind the camera. Will, thank you. And check out Will's books. He has multiple volumes, and one will be coming out soon, volume 2, about the Petersburg campaign. So you don't want to miss those. Be sure to check those out on Amazon. And of course, thank you for watching. Please click that subscribe button. Please click that like button. And on behalf of the American Battlefield Trust, I'm Kris White. Thank you for watching, and thank you for supporting battlefield education and preservation.
Hello, this is Trace Atkins. To stay up to date on all the latest and coolest videos, please subscribe to the Trust's YouTube channel. Preserve, educate, inspire.